Okay, yesterday I talked about microevaluation. And what I'd like to do in this workshop is just take you through the planning of a microevaluation, right? I just sat in a very interesting talk that was looking at a whole course, and during this course the students had to make a number of short videos, right? If one was doing an evaluation of the whole course, then you would evaluate everything that went on in the course. But another possibility might be to select just one of the little videos they had to make and look at the process that was involved in making it and evaluate that. Another point that I want to make about what I'm talking about, microevaluation, is that we are not evaluating the students. Although evaluating the students may be part of what we do, but the purpose is not student evaluation, it's activity evaluation. The extent to which you feel the activity was successful or not successful. So what I'm going to do is to get you to try to plan a microevaluation of a task. And this is the kind of task that I'm going to talk about because it's a task that I've become quite interested in for a variety of reasons. It's called a problem solution task. And the whole idea of a problem solution is that you give some brief situational information and then a problem related to that particular situation, and then you ask the students to work out what they think is the best solution for it, right? So it's a very, very simple task. And this is the task that I'm going to ask you to work with. Nowadays, many people have access to computers on a wide basis, and a large number of children play computer games. What are the negative impacts of playing computer games, and what can be done to minimize the bad effects for children, right? Let me make one general point. I'm going to give you this problem. I guess that if one was teaching an actual class, sometimes one might give students the problem that they had to think about and produce a solution for. At other times, you might then ask them to identify their own problem as well. But for the purposes of this workshop, I'm going to give you this particular problem. Believe it or not, there's been a lot of research that's looked at the problem-solution pattern, including whole books written on the problem-solution pattern. One of the best-known books is by someone called Hoey, H-O-E-Y, who's looked at the linguistic properties of this particular pattern. But the basic pattern is shown on this screen here. And you have a situation which provides the background information. Then you have a statement of what the problem is. And then there is a solution to that particular problem, a proposal about how the problem can be overcome. And this can involve a single solution, or it can in fact involve multiple solutions. Or it could involve one solution and a discussion of that solution, an evaluation of it, and if the evaluation is negative, one would go back to actually thinking of another solution, etc. Then there is the evaluation. Each proposal is evaluated in terms of its advantages and disadvantages, and finally conclusion, a statement of the solution considered the best, or a statement about how to choose from alternative proposals for solving the problem. So that's the basic pattern of problem solution. And you can actually show what goes on in problem solution diagrammatically here. Situation, problem, solution. And you can see there's two arrows going from solution to evaluation, because you can actually go back and offer another solution, and it can go on and on and on round until you've actually arrived at the particular solution that you think is best. Okay, so now we move to how do you plan a problem solution lesson? How do you plan a lesson based on the particular problem that I've given to you, which, if you remember, was about children using computer-based games, etc. And I guess this is very much an issue in Japan, isn't it? Yeah? Lots of children spend lots of times on computer playing games, etc. Yeah? And this whole issue is, does this create any problems? And if there are problems, what do we do about those particular problems, right? Okay. This is the performance task that you're giving the students to actually do. You have to prepare a 5-minute speech on the topic. Actually, and we won't do child labour. This is another one, actually, but I think probably the one that I've already given to you is a more interesting one, which is children playing computer games. In your talk, you will need to explain why and where there is a child labour, or why and where there is a problem with children playing computer games. You've got to identify the nature of the problem precisely, and you've got to suggest 2 solutions for the problem and evaluate each solution and reach a conclusion. Okay? So let's take the task that I first put, rather than this one, child labour. Let's take children playing computer games, yeah? And what I would like you to do is to work with a partner, very, very briefly, and to think about what the nature of the problem is, and then how you can actually solve that particular problem. So I'd like you to talk together with a partner. First of all, identifying the problem, or the nature of the problem. There's probably more than one problem connected with that situation. And then what kind of solution you have, right? So working in pairs, I have to see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We've got an odd one here, right? Maybe the 3 of you can talk, right? I will move along a little bit so that there's a little bit more space between you. Just move along, you to the end there. That's it, and then you move along. So you 2, and you can move along to the end there. Sorry, yeah, yes, you move to the end seat. I'm trying to separate you out so it's easier for you to talk. All right, you just move, and you move with her, right? You 3 move, you 3 move along, and you 2 there, etc. Right? So let me make it very clear again. Right? The problem is young children playing computer games. That's the situation. What are the problems with that particular situation? And then what are the possible solutions? So let me please just spend 2 or 3 minutes working on the nature of the problem and the solutions. I don't mind if you talk in Japanese, but when you describe the problems and the solutions, you must describe the problems and the solutions in English. So you can talk together in Japanese, but you must actually produce a description of the problems and the solutions in Japanese, in English. This can guide you. This is the instructions. So it asks you to make notes, right? And if you have a piece of paper, you can do this. Or if you want, you can just do it orally, right? The situation is already given to you, which is young children spending a lot of time playing computer games, right? That's the situation. What's the problem? What are the solutions? What's your evaluation of the solutions? people's ideas about the problem, different people's ideas about solution, but I would like to just hear one or two pairs. Who would like to venture to tell me problem, solutions, their evaluation of them?
We'll try.
You'll try. Right. Do we have a microphone or do you have a very loud voice?
Both.
We'll try. I have a loud voice, I guess.
Go ahead. Yeah,
One of the problems was self-regulation, that if they're playing a lot of video games, they'll often spend a lot of time, and because it's spending too much time, it becomes problematic. If they spend all of their time playing video games. So that's an example of one problem. Okay. Exposure to violence. Oh, wow. Can you hear me? Okay. Sorry. Exposure to violence, playing video games, exposes students or young people to potential violence, and that could reflect in their behavior.
Okay.
Overstimulation, watching videos a long period of time can overstimulate. So as a result of overstimulation, it can impact their attention span.
Okay.
How's that?
Well, yeah, you've identified a few problems, now solutions.
Okay.
I said, like they should be told to do some tasks, and then the game is like a reward, so they cannot play it without completing some other tasks. So they learn that concept of discipline and reward system.
That's a solution to which problem?
Everything.
You must relate the
Too much-
solution to the
spending too
particular
much
problem. So you have a problem
Ah.
of self-regulation.
So I
So
think
what's the
from
solution what's the solution to the problem of self-regulation?
yeah, I mean that's a discipline strategy. So I think that could be a solution to the self-regulation.
Okay.
Yeah,
Good solution?
I think so.
You have to evaluate your solution.
Oh, we didn't
We
evaluate.
didn't get that
Yeah.
far. We thought that we needed to focus for 2 minutes
All right,
on the
all right,
problem.
I agree, I agree. This would take a lot longer. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
Let's
you.
hear one other pair, okay? And I think it would be nice to hear from some of the Japanese people here, some of the Japanese students here. I have a policy in all my classes of never nominating students to speak. So I'm just going to invite you to decide who would like to stand up and suggest what you see as the problems and the solutions.
You can do it, girls!
No, let them be.
Yay!
The problem is you're gonna have the bad eyesight, and the solution is use the blue light glasses.
A little louder for me.
So the problem is you're gonna have the bad eyesight,
Of bad eyesight.
and the solution is using blue light glasses.
Okay. Because they're looking at a lot of blue light. Yeah, on the screen. Yeah? Solution?
That was the solution.
Eh?
That was the solution. So using
Eh?
the solution is using glasses which cut the blue light.
Okay, okay, all right. Okay, so, that's the starting point of my lesson, and obviously this would take a lot longer in a lesson because students would have much longer. I would actually make them complete this chart and write down what the situation was, the problem, solutions, etc. I don't mind if they talk in Japanese to do that. I'm not so obsessed about all the English lesson. always being in English, right? But what I would insist is that what they put on the chart is in English, okay? That's how I would do it. But of course, ultimately, we're going to evaluate what I've done, and I've already made certain methodological decisions. One, they can use Japanese when they're talking, as long as they write it down in English, right? Two, as a teacher, I never nominate. I always leave it to students to elect. I have to tell you a little story here. I once did a research project with a student who was teaching in a junior college, and he wanted to investigate the relationship between student participation and personality, right? And personality. And in order to do this, he had to create a situation where students could choose to participate or not choose. Because of course, if the teacher chooses, you're overriding personality, right? You're negating the effect of personality on whether students elect to speak or not speak. So he devised a very simple activity. He gave them a reading passage, and they had to read the reading passage at home and write 3 questions they would like to ask about the topic. 3 questions they would like to ask about the topic of the reading passage. And then when they came back next day, he said, what I want you to do now is to ask each other questions, right? And answer each other's questions. And then he got a chair and he sat down and he waited until a student put their hand up to start to ask a question, right? He said that the first time he did this, it was very, very painful because he had to sit for 10 minutes before a student eventually put their hand up, right? Wait longer until another student answered. He used the same technique for the whole semester, right? By the end of the semester, students were putting their hand up, speaking, no pausing. All the students were completely filling. What does this show? What this shows is that Japanese students are prepared to initiate in class, but you have to be patient as a teacher and put them in a position where you almost embarrass them initially to have a go on putting their hand up, right? Because otherwise they will always wait for each other. But once they realize that they don't have to wait for each other, then they start to speak in the classroom in the same way that they would speak in the cafeteria with each other, right? It's possible in a classroom. I've never accepted that Japanese students are not prepared to communicate easily, naturally in a classroom. But you have to create the appropriate rules in the classroom, right? And unless you do that, there will always be a reluctance to actually speak, right? 10 minutes. He sat on a chair and said nothing until a student eventually put their hand up, right? But by being prepared to do that, he broke the whole normal convention of what Japanese students do, okay? I never nominate. I always ask people to volunteer, and if necessary, I will sit and wait 5 minutes until they do so. Instructions 2, work with a partner, listen to his ideas about how to solve the problem of child labor. As you listen, make notes about his ideas by completing the same table, right? So initially people would fill out the table individually, and then they would work in pairs to do this, right? So that's the second stage. There are alternative ways of doing it. Rehearse your speech. You can record your speech and listen to it. What aspects of your speech need improving? One is to do it entirely individually and let people record what they think the problems are, what they think the solutions are, etc. So this is alternative. And you will now give your speech and listen to the other students giving your speech. You will have to evaluate the speeches you listen to, so decide the criteria you will use for evaluation. In other words, you can have a different methodology for actually doing the problem solution task. Okay, this is really what I want to talk about. I've given you an idea of what the lesson will consist of. In fact, I've given you 2 different versions of the same lesson, etc. So if we wanted to evaluate this lesson that I've just introduced to you, what would we do? How would we set about actually trying to evaluate it as a lesson? Well, the first thing that we would have to decide, as I showed you yesterday, is why are we doing the evaluation? And there are really always 2 reasons for carrying out an evaluation of a particular classroom activity. One is accountability. Does the activity work in the way that I wanted it to work? Okay. And the second is development. Having taught this particular activity, what changes would I want to make to it in order to try to make it work better next time? There's always these 2 fundamental reasons for carrying out an evaluation. So, in the lesson that I've just given to you, we could either just have one, we could simply say, did the lesson work in the way in which I wanted it to work, or we could actually also include the accountability. What changes would I make to it, etc. You've also got to think about the aims of your evaluation, right? And to investigate how students prepare for a speech involving a problem solution pattern when A, working in a group or working independently. So I gave you 2 versions of the same lesson. One is where the students were doing it all independently and then had to give the speech, right? And the other is where they were working in pairs and interacted in pairs and eventually would have to give a speech as well, right? So, one of my aims might be to investigate these 2 different ways, yeah? To what extent is it better to give someone the problem, and ask them to work independently, recording their speech, revising what they have recorded, etc., or is it better to put people into pairs, etc.? I mean, that's quite an interesting question. And in general, people would feel that it's better to put people into pairs. Would you agree? Yeah? Teachers in general would tend to favor using pair work and getting students to interact, right? But is it in fact better? Do you end up with better speeches when students do that? Or do you end up with better speeches when students are working by themselves and revising what they're doing, rehearsing what they're doing, etc.? So that might be one of the aims of the evaluation. The second is to investigate which of 2 ways of preparing for a speech is more effective in enabling students to give an effective speech, and 3, to investigate students' views about the 2 ways of preparing for speech involving a problem solution pattern. So those might be the aims that I might have for my evaluation. If you want to carry out an evaluation of an activity, you must formulate your aims because they are going to drive how you actually do the evaluation. There's also the question of who will do the evaluation. Are you going to do it by yourself as the teacher, or are you going to bring in another teacher to help you carry out the evaluation? And I think that there are obvious advantages of bringing in another teacher and planning and carrying out the evaluation jointly, etc., right? Particularly if you're both doing the same task, the same activity in different classes. You can help plan and carry it out in different classes, and you have the advantage of being able to compare the results of one class from the results of another class. Which type of evaluation? And those of you who were present yesterday will remember that I pointed out that there are basically 3 types of evaluation that you can carry out. One is a student-based evaluation, and this is the one that is perhaps the easiest to carry out, and the one that is most common most commonly used by teachers. So student-based evaluation means that we find out the students' views, opinions about the particular activity that they engaged in. And you did that. You asked the students, but you didn't do it in terms of particular activities, you did it in terms of the whole course. And in general, when people do student evaluations, they do not do it with regard to a particular activity, they do it with regard to the whole course, right? In my university, once students have finished a particular course, there is a formal process by which they can evaluate that particular course, right? What I'm arguing is that end of course evaluation is actually much less useful than micro-evaluation of individual activities, right? And if you want to build up a picture of an evaluation of a whole course, it's probably better to do it through carrying out evaluations of particular activities that are a part of the course. So in your case, they have a number of videos to make, so you might want to focus on them evaluating one particular video, right, and their experience. And then you could repeat it with another video as well, and to see to what extent that their evaluation changed. So student evaluation, then you have a response-based evaluation, where the evaluator seeks to determine whether the task elicited the performance processes and the outcome intended, right? Again, if I take your example, you had a different policy to me, because when they were preparing their video, which was an essential part of the process, you required them to speak in English, right? As well as producing the video in English. You wanted both the process of making the video and the video itself to be in English, right? I didn't. I said to you, I don't mind if you speak in Japanese, right? But you must complete the chart in English, right? And you must be able to give the solutions to the problem and the evaluation of those solutions in English, right? So, if you were carrying out your evaluation and you were looking at a response-based evaluation, one of the things that you would need to look at is the extent to which they really were using English as opposed to Japanese. And you cannot do that by just giving them a questionnaire and asking them, because they won't be honest, right? You know that, and I know that, right? The only way you can do it is by actually recording their conversations and then looking at their conversations to see to what extent they are using English, they are using Japanese. So you seem pretty confident that they were using Japanese, that they were using English, right? And not using Japanese, but you don't have the evidence, right? You don't actually have the evidence, yeah? This was based on your impression. So the whole idea of carrying out an evaluation of activity is to force you to go beyond your impression and collect evidence to see, in fact, whether that's happening. So, if I was evaluating you doing the task, as I asked you to look at it, I would maybe record you doing the task, and I would be interested in seeing whether you were using Japanese or English, or whether you were translanguaging, sometimes using English, sometimes using Japanese, right? Yeah? And in fact, these days, a lot of people are arguing that translanguaging is more effective than just doing it in English, right? That's one of the arguments that is currently going on in applied linguistics. So I would record you to see what you were doing, but I would also collect in your chart. And I would want to see whether you had what you had written in your chart, yeah? And whether you'd just written notes, or whether you'd written full sentences, whether what you had written was clear or not clear, etc., right? And that would be part of response-based evaluation, okay? When it comes to a learning-based evaluation, this is much more difficult, right? A learning-based evaluation means that you have got to investigate whether students have learned anything, right? And it's very difficult to show that people have actually learned some new language from doing one activity, right? It's actually quite difficult to show whether they've learned any language from a whole course, right? Because if you pre-test and post-test, then the difference in the scores between pre-test and post-test over one semester is obviously so little as not to actually show any significant change statistically, yeah? Again, I think a very interesting thing for you is to what extent you believe, it's a belief that you have, very firmly held, that as a result of doing this video course, their English will have improved, right? I could ask you, how has it improved? What evidence do you have that it's improved? Is it vocabulary that's improved? Is it pronunciation that's improved? Is their grammar improved, etc.? Has their fluency improved? I could ask you those questions. And we could ask the same questions about the performance of a particular task. The way in which I would do the learning-based evaluation is, again, to actually ask students to report any way in which they think their language is improved as a result of doing the task, right? I would ask them to make a note of any new vocabulary that they might have learnt as a result of doing the task. I would ask them to make a note of any other way in which they felt that this task had improved their actual ability to use it, right? So I would not be looking objectively at whether any learning had taken place. I would be looking at the learner's subjective views as to whether any learning had taken place. And I think that that is quite useful. If you're going to do a evaluation, the next question that you have to ask yourself is what data are you going to collect? What evidence are you going to collect in order to investigate whether the aims of your task have actually been met? Okay? And I suggested that there are really three types of principal data that you can collect. One is observational data. You can actually observe people. This is very difficult to do if you are a teacher evaluating your own task without the help of another person. But if you have the help of another person, then you can use that person to carry out an observation of how the students are doing the task and how you're doing the task with the students, etc. Right? So observational data. One way to do this is to try to draw up a chart of particular behaviors that you are hoping to see in the classroom and whether these behaviors actually occur, right? Talks that I attended yesterday, very often I heard the presenter of the course claiming that what they were doing with the students was very motivating, that the students were very interested in the activity, etc. Okay? Now, if you're carrying out the kind of evaluation I'm asking, you can't make that statement without evidence, right? You can't just say, oh, my students were very interested, they were very motivated. You have to be able to say, to give evidence to support that particular claim. Now that raises a very interesting question, because how are you actually going to investigate the extent to which learners are engaged or motivated in doing a particular task, right? Through observation, not just through giving them some kind of little questionnaire which asks them how motivated they are. That's back to student response. You want to actually look at their behavior while they're doing the task. So I might say, I asked you very quickly to work in pairs to do the task. What could I look at to see whether in fact you were motivated in doing the particular task that I'd given you to do, right? Well, one thing I could look at is the extent to which you were talking to each other, and to the extent to which the talking was interactive, right? I noticed that some people were doing what I asked them to do, and were engaging interactively in discussing the solutions to the problem. I noticed other people who talked for a little while and then stopped talking, right? And I could look at all the different pairs of people, and I could say, well, out of the 10 pairs in my class, 6 of them seem to be actively engaged, right? And 4 of them seem to be only minimally engaged, etc. Just by observing the extent to which they were interacting, yeah? So I could collect evidence over the extent to which the class as a whole was really motivated in what I was doing. Of course, you can also, as part of observational data, you can record students, right? The problem with recording students is, these days it's easy, because they all have cell phones and they can do the recording on the cell phone, and then they can send you a copy of their recording. So it's very easy for you to collect it in, etc., right? But it's still very time consuming, because you've got to listen to the recordings, and if you want to do a really detailed analysis, you've got to transcribe how they were talking when they were working in pairs in order to investigate. Or at least you'd have to randomly select maybe 4 pairs and transcribe those 4 pairs and then see to what extent they were interacting in the way that you wanted them to interact. So in your case, you would look to see whether they were interacting in English, right? I would be less concerned with that, but I might be interested in the extent to which they were translanguaging, using a mixture of Japanese and English in order to do the task. You wanted to ask a question?
Yeah, just sort of your thoughts on getting students to do the transcription rather than...
Yeah, you can get students to do the transcript. In effect, that becomes another teaching activity. And if you were carrying out an evaluation, you would have to include the students doing the transcript in your evaluation. In other words, you'd have to ask a question like, to what extent does getting students to do a transcript improve the performance of the task, help to ensure the task is done in the way that you hoped it would do, etc. Right? Yeah, you can get them to do the transcription, but it becomes a teaching activity and therefore subject to evaluation. Okay? Not just assuming that getting them to do the transcript is a good thing.
With questionnaire data, is getting them to fill in a questionnaire in English and using English not subject.
It is, but it's very brief, whereas preparing a transcript is quite a major activity, right? But yes, you could also, in your questionnaire, your student questionnaire, ask them a question about did they find answering this questionnaire useful, right? You could do that, yeah? The whole idea is getting evidence for something that you're doing and not just making assumptions that what you're doing is working in the way in which you wanted it to work, hoped it would work, etc. Evidence. Oh, the last one is outcome data. Outcome data is the finished product. So in your case, it was fairly easy. The finished product is the video, and you can evaluate the video in terms of the extent to which you feel they produce the kind of quality video that you'd hope they would produce, right? In the case of the task that I gave you, it's the final oral presentations of what the situation is, what the problem is, what solutions they gave to the problem, and their evaluations of it, etc. So it would be an actual brief oral presentation, and again, you can evaluate that, right? Of course, once you evaluate that, you're doubling up. You're evaluating it because you wanted to know whether the task worked, but you're teachers and you have to evaluate the students to give them a grade, right? So in that case, the evaluation of the product serves a double purpose. It provides an evaluation of the student, which is normally what teachers use it for, but what I'm interested in is using the evaluation of the product to evaluate the task and how the task was actually performed as well. Not saying, oh, my students didn't do this activity very well, etc., right? And giving them a grade, or my students all did it very well. But asking what I have seen about how my students did the final activity, produced the video, gave the oral presentation, etc. What does it show about the effectiveness of the way in which I did this particular task in the classroom? You're asking a slightly different question from the one that one normally asks. How will you analyze the data? It can be analyzed quantitatively, or it can be analyzed qualitatively. Quantitatively, to go back to your situation, you don't want them to use Japanese, so you could observe to what extent they are using English and to what extent they are using Japanese. What is the ratio of Japanese to English, etc. Okay? There's other things that you can look at. If it involves a pair work or group work where students have to work collaboratively, you could actually examine to what extent they are behaving in a collaborative way. To do that, you'd have to decide what you mean by collaboration. What is the evidence of collaboration? If we talk about a group behaving collaboratively, what do we actually mean by that? What kinds of actual oral behaviors, interactional behaviors, demonstrate collaboratively, right? There's actually research that's looked at that and been done that. But you would have to do that. And you can do it either quantitatively, you can find specific measures and then count them in the interaction, or you can just produce a more qualitative analysis of what's going on in a particular interaction. What will you do with your evaluation? Well, there are 4 possibilities here. One is obviously to use it to revise the task, yeah? And that's one of the main purposes of doing a task evaluation. I think teachers do this all the time. They use an activity and they form an impressionistic evaluation of that activity, and then they make changes. But what I'm arguing is that not every time, but sometimes, teachers would benefit from carrying out a more systematic, rigorous task evaluation, and then making changes to it on the basis of what they found out, right? Teachers will always function impressionistically, and they should do. But sometimes teachers should try to be more systematic in the way in which they answer the key question, did my activity work, right? Not, oh, I thought it worked well today. How often does one hear teachers say that? I thought it worked well today, right? And my answer to you was, well, how do you know? Where's your evidence, right? And sometimes, at least, I think teachers need to do it. Give a paper at a conference. I think I mentioned this in my talk yesterday, but I think it would be great if teachers would go and talk about the activities and lessons that they have given to their students, yeah? And not just tell us about the lesson, but tell us what they have found out about that lesson when they carried out an evaluation of the main task in it, right? So that they not just present the activity and some theoretical reasons for why the activity is a great one, but they also give us some evidence about what they found out when they used this task with a particular group of students, right? Or write a paper for a journal. And there are journals in Japan that encourage people to write more practical type papers, yeah? And one very practical type paper that you can write was, I've always thought that this activity was an interesting, good activity, right? But I've often wondered, just how well it works. So this time I decided to carry out a systematic evaluation of it. And in my paper, I'm going to describe the activity, and then I'm going to describe what I found out by carrying out a systematic evaluation, right? It gives you a basis for both the conference paper and for writing very simple papers. And these are just sorts of possible topics for problem solution solution is such a powerful way of conducting an oral classroom, an oral course. And you can see that I've given you a web page here. I've taken these topics from that web page. If you actually put problem solution pattern into Google, you'll be amazed how much you get up, right? There's a huge amount of stuff describing what it's done, giving you different problem solution activities such as these here. And that concludes. Oh, it does one last thing. Using questions to guide students. If you want to give a little bit more guidance to students, you can give them this. You can give them the situation and the questions they ask about the situation, questions they ask about the problem, etc. This gives a little bit more guidance for them to do a problem